programs, all falling under the title of the Holocaust in Lithuania. In this series, what we wanted to do is to zero in on one region and offer a better understanding of what happened during the war, and also get a glimpse into Jewish culture before the Holocaust, and also deal with questions of post-war memory that we will see today, how they're all interwoven into the work of Avram Sutzkever, the Yiddish poet, and the scholar Justin Cammy, who wrote an introduction and edited a very powerful memoir that Sutzkever wrote after the war. I wanted to thank our partners in Lithuania. The series actually is a partnership with Vilnius University. Yeshiva University in its very core is a Lithuanian yeshiva, and we are so proud that we connected with our colleagues from across the ocean. We remember and retain Lithuania on our minds, in our hearts. Lithuania is also the home for terrific students and scholars. I wanted to thank Dr. Jurgita Verbikiene, Dr. Dovilet Roskavaite, who are our colleagues for the series. As a part of the partnership with Vilnius University, we had an exchange program. I will maybe mention briefly that our student Vesta Svensson, who is going to interview Justin Cammy today, just came back from Vilnius. Maybe Vesta would want to say a few words about it during the talk. She was the first of our MA students who went on an exchange with Vilnius University. I had the pleasure to welcome a student from Lithuania who came here to America. This partnership also included in the spring semester a course on the longue durée, on the broad history of Jews in Lithuania, that was co-taught at the same time, 12 p.m. in New York and 7 p.m. in Lithuania, for students at Yeshiva University in the Fish Center program and students in Vilnius University. I also wanted to thank Elliot Matz, who is the head of the Rumšiškės Marketown Museum Corporation. If you want to look into Rumšiškės' Marketown Museum, you will learn about an effort to create an open space museum that would revive the memory of the market town, an effort that he leads. And Elliot was, among some other people, one of the shotchanim, one of the matchmakers who connected us at Yeshiva University with our colleagues in Lithuania. This is also our colleagues in Lithuania. This is also a great opportunity to thank the assistant director of the Fish Center, Odaya Blau, and our administrative assistant, our academic administrator, Brittany Hager McNeely, for doing a lot of the back-end work on facilitating the series. And of course, to thank Vesta Svensson, our MA student, who has done a phenomenal job, not just coordinating this series, but taking all roles of coordinating, doing publicity, designing the series, and then at the end also doing the interviews. This was a tour de force, and I'm sure that this is going to be a grand finale for a phenomenal series. So thank you, Vesta, for doing all that. Okay, I'm going to leave the floor to now Vesta and Justin. Thank you all for being with us. Stay tuned. Please feel free to go to the Fish Center website, www.yu.edu/fish-center, to learn more about our activities, sign up for our master's degree. We have a certificate for teachers that we're launching in the fall semester. Stay tuned, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pilnik. Hi, everyone. My name is Vesta Svensson, and I'm a master's candidate and a student fellow at the Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I'm speaking with you today from Washington, D.C., where I'm in residency as a summer graduate fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I've been delighted to curate the 4 sessions of the Holocaust in Lithuania speaker series this spring, of which today's session is the concluding talk. The prior 3 sessions are all on the Fish Center's YouTube page, so feel free to go check them out. And also through an opportunity accorded by the Fish Center and the Rumšiškės Marketown Museum, I was privileged to travel to Vilnius only 2 weeks ago. And so Vilna and Lithuania are very immediate to me at the moment. Today, I will be interviewing Dr. Justin Cammy, the editor and translator of Abraham Sutzkever's groundbreaking From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg. Dr. Justin Cammy is a professor of Jewish Studies and World Literatures at Smith College. He's a literary and cultural historian who specializes in Yiddish, chairing both the program in World Literatures and the program in Jewish Studies. Dr. Cammy also holds appointments in Russian and Eastern European Studies, Middle Eastern Studies, and Translation Studies. He's on sabbatical for the upcoming academic year, and he'll be a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge in the fall, and then Rutgers in the spring. His critical edition and translation of Abraham Sutzkever's From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg won the MLA Prize for Yiddish, the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Yiddish, the Feinstone Prize for the best translation of a book on a Jewish theme from the J.I. Siegel Awards. So hello, Dr. Cammy, and thank you for speaking with me today.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Vesta. And I've never spoken at Yeshiva, so this is a big honor.
Fabulous. It's a first. So firstly, though it was your translation and editing of Sutzkever's book that has brought us here, I came across the following line in your Smith College bio, which I found very intriguing. Your scholarship on the generation of when Yiddish was young challenges post-war mythologies of Yiddish. Can you speak to the post-war mythology and tell us a little bit about some of the colorful figures of Young Vilna?
Sure. I'm so happy you started with when Yiddish was young. So when I got into this field, one of the things that I wanted to do was to disassociate the assumption, especially among some of my students when I started out teaching, that Yiddish was somehow associated with old age, with the past, with history, with death, with martyrdom, with the Holocaust. And I resolved at that time to make sure that I always was able to balance not only my teaching, but my own research in ways that would allow me to be responsible to a large spectrum of what was produced and cultivated in Yiddish, rather than focusing on a single era. So my initial work on When Yiddish Was Young was a focus on a group of, one might say, avant-garde, sometimes modernist, sometimes populist, leftist writers in what was then Polish Vilna, now today Lithuanian Vilnius. And one could argue that they were the last of the major Yiddish interwar movements. And why this group was interesting, apart from them as a collective, has to do with the fact that several major post-war Yiddish writers came out of them, mainly Avram Sutzkever, the great Yiddish poet, and also Chaim Grade, who was a poet when he started out as a Yiddish writer, but then quickly moved to become a Yiddish prose writer and great novelist. And I wanted to recuperate the early histories of these two major writers, but also perhaps the unwritten histories of the chorus, the background figures that had never before really been written about, at least in English, for an English-speaking audience. So that's what started out as a real interest in understanding what did it mean to be a young, for the most part, most of these individuals were men. There were a few women who were part of the Young Vilna or Young Vilna group. But what did it mean to be young in the late 1920s and 30s in interwar Poland, and especially in Vilna? What was the Yiddish scene like? What would it feel like to be 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, starting out as a writer and wanting to make their mark in the Yiddish world? How did one incorporate the local flavor of Vilna, which had a certain pedigree in the Jewish world, also with a certain cosmopolitan or perhaps broader interest in writing about things that went beyond Vilna? How did one incorporate sort of the small townness of being in a place like Vilna with also wanting to be in a transnational literature that had a broader reach? So that was really my interest in writing about a period when Yiddish was young and really thought or saw that it had the whole world ahead of it. And that would then challenge the associations that I started out enumerating earlier, somehow Yiddish being a dying or even a dead language. That's not to say that my research hasn't taken me in other directions, and certainly the Sutzkever volume that you just introduced would be one of those areas, and I think an important area. And when Sutzkever writes to Leivik in New York in the mid to late 1930s, one of the things that's remarkable is that for the New York Yiddish writers, there was a sense already by the 30s that they were losing their mass audience, and a sense that, the European, especially the Polish Yiddish writers had their audience, that audience was still there. And Sutzkever writes a letter to Leivik in New York and says that here I am in Vilna, and of course Vilna there then has YIVO, and Vilna has the Yiddish Pen Club, and Vilna has the Yiddish Teachers Seminary, and Yiddish has all of these Yiddish-speaking institutions, youth groups, and he writes to Leivik, as a writer here in Vilna, I'm completely alone. I have no one to talk to. So this was pretty remarkable for me to think about. How could it be that a young writer starting out in Vilna in the early and mid 1930s would write to a writer in New York and say, a Yiddish writer, and say that here in Vilna, I have no one to talk to. And that got me thinking about ways to perhaps recuperate some of these histories, some of these texts. And really one of the amazing joys of my career, you say that you were just in Vilnius a few weeks ago, I was there in March, is the increasing knowledge and focus of these sources among Lithuanian readers. It's a slow process, but it's continuing. And I think that at a certain point, these texts are going to be more common for Lithuanian readers than they even are for Jewish readers outside of that area. So I'm really excited to see that one of our participants today is Saula, who will be translating, or who has translated the new Lithuanian edition of From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg. And when I was talking to your students before we came on to this session, one of the amazing things about scholarship is you always learn more, right? When you interact with other scholars and you think you get everything right, and then you interact with others. And Saula has shown me how many things need to be corrected or improved. So there's always, in new translations and in new editions, there's always ways to find new information, to reach new audiences, and to perhaps create a more empathetic reading of writers, and in so doing, to allow Lithuanians to come back into contact with their own history that was so violently interrupted by a variety of historical forces.
Now, what can you say about the specific role of Vilna in fostering this culture? I mean, Warsaw had a specific culture, Minsk had a specific culture, Odessa. Now, taking those political situations and history out of the conversation, just focusing on Vilna, how do you feel that the sense of place actually influenced what came out of it?
I think we can't overrate the importance of mythology in creating a sense of place and how people relate to their environments. It's always been interesting to me why certain cities attract writers, attract cultural movements, and some cities just don't. And I think part of that has to do with the mythologies that are not only written at the time, but also in retrospect. But when we think of Vilna at the time, there was a conscious effort beginning at the very beginning of the 20th century, if it's in secular terms, in religious terms, certainly earlier than that, to establish Vilna as the capital of a intellectual, sophisticated, worldly, scholarly Jewish world that was in touch with Jewish sources, including Jewish linguistic sources, and that was different in some way than the mass culture that was going on in Poland, and especially in Warsaw. And Sam Casso, of course, has written quite a bit about this, as well as others, that what Warsaw had in demographics, in terms of numbers, not only numbers of readers, not only numbers of Jews, not only diversity of Jews, not only number of papers, not only numbers of everything that you could enumerate, perhaps Vilna had in status, that is in quality. So it's quality versus quantity. And that was then continually impressed upon young students who were growing up, young kids who were growing up in Vilna, this idea that maybe they were at least geographically a backwater in terms of size and in terms of location, but in terms of what they were able to produce culturally, they were an exporter of culture rather than an importer of culture. They could be a vanguard rather than a follower. They could lead rather than being the mass consumer. And I think for Vilna Jewry, whether it be in the period of the Haskalah, whether it be in the period of rabbinic literature, whether it be in the period of the writing of Yiddish literature, whether it be in politics, especially with the rise, for instance, of the Bund, whether it be in teachers' seminaries, whether it be in schooling, whether it be in academics with the establishment of the Jewish Scientific Institute or YIVO, Vilna always sought to, through its small but cohesive numbers, to produce something that could then serve as a model to the broader Yiddish and even the broader Jewish world.
I definitely got a sense of that when I was there. Can you tell us a little bit about Abraham Sutzkever before the war, so before your book begins?
Yeah, so Sutzkever goes as a very young boy. Sutzkever is born in Smargon, which is today across the border in Belarus. As a result of World War I, the family is displaced, and he spends his childhood years in Siberia. And in Siberia, his father dies and his sister contracts brain inflammation, and eventually she will die too. So when he comes back to Vilnius after the war, he's coming back with his mother and a brother. The brother eventually emigrates to what was then Palestine. So Sutzkever is left alone with his mother. He goes to a Hebrew-speaking gymnasium, but of course the language around him is Yiddish. And he very quickly, by the late 20s, has a sense of himself as an aesthetic figure. And it's not long into the 1930s that he applies for membership in what was then a much smaller cohort of writers that had already congealed in 1929 around this movement that was known as Young Vilna. And Sutzkever at the time is rejected. So this is one of the great sort of curiosities of Yiddish literary history, that the person who would go on to write some fairly important young Yiddish poetry before the war, who would go on to write some of the most important Yiddish poetry during the war, who would go on to write an early memoir of the destruction of Vilnius, who would then go on to become one of the great editors of Yiddish literature and publish several dozen books up through his death in 2010, that he was rejected by his fellow young writers in Vilna when he applied for membership, mainly because the assumption was that he wasn't a poet who was engagé. And we can read that as saying he wasn't political enough. His writing was about nature. His writing was, in the sky. And the feeling was at the time, at least in Young Vilna, that one needed to write about the conditions, mounting Polish xenophobia, the unemployed, class differentiation, political problems, the challenge eventually of the Soviet Union across one border and the rise of Nazi Germany across the other border. Sutzkever was not interested for the most of the 1930s in those questions. Sometimes he was able to force himself to write for the political moment, but for the most part, his first book of poetry is about Siberia, and his second book of poetry, published in 1940, is about the forests. So this is the type of writer that he is as a young man, and I think that sense of himself as a poet first, not as a servant of a broader political need, but as a poet first, allowed him to retain that poetic poise and bring that poetic poise with him into the ghetto, so that even when the conditions changed, the external, the material conditions, right? The same material conditions that he wasn't interested in so much before the war, he still wasn't so interested in during the war. And the standards of poetry had not changed, which is why he's able to maintain a certain level of poetic writing, and also a level of mythologizing and self-mythologization that allows him to then produce what he's able to do during the war.
Yes, that was in Samuel Bach's autobiography. He described Sutzkever as a sort of debonair figure that, the ladies were very charmed by this sort of thing. You know, after the war, Sutzkever wrote a poem to Samuel's mother, lauding her, you know, efforts to keep the genius alive and everything. But, you know, he doesn't come off as a political figure, which is intriguing. Can you give us a very, very brief, and I'm sorry to ask you to do this, but very, very brief blip on the book itself, since not everybody in our audience has read it?
So I'm assuming you're talking about this book, right?
I am indeed, yes.
All right, so from the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, briefly, Sutzkever writes, or is asked to write, a, let's say, entry by two very famous Soviet writers, Ilya Ehrenberg and Vasily Grossman, as part of what was supposed to be a project called the Black Book Project. And this project was meant to collect histories of the destruction of certain Jewish communities that were Soviet communities or Soviet cities, meaning Soviet at the time of the German invasion, especially in 1941, although they included a few others as well. And Sutzkever was asked to write the entry on Vilna, which he does because he was rescued in part through the efforts of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and made his way after the destruction of the Vilna Ghetto, and after spending half a year in the forests of Lithuania, he and his wife are airlifted and brought to Moscow. And it's there that the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and those responsible for the Black Book Project ask him to contribute an entry for this book. And when Vilna is liberated in 1944, he's also asked, he rushes back to Vilna, sees that the degree of devastation, and is asked to add a final chapter on the liberation of the city. And he does so. That writing eventually doesn't get published. The Black Book does not get published at the time, although the manuscript has since, many years later, has since been published. And he is given permission to publish it on his own. And two different editions come out. One that's published in Moscow in 1947, and then one that's published in Paris by the Association of Yiddish Writers in Paris, also in 1947. There are variations between the two, although I would say that probably 93% of the editions are the same. And in that volume, which is not a diary, and it's oftentimes mistaken, it's not a diary of his time in the ghetto. And we have to differentiate as Holocaust scholars, right, between primary sources. Something that's written like Crook's Diary of the Vilna Ghetto at the time, without the perspective, the advantage of perspective, is very different even than what Sutzkever was able to do, because Sutzkever is able to write his memoir not only from his own memory, but especially from his interviews with others and from his ability to read the diaries of those who come before them. And much of that then is sort of transformed, adapted, and shaped into not only his own memoir, but a collective memoir at the same time. So the volume that I translated, which had been translated into several other languages before, but never to English, is a translation of this early memoir of the Vilna Ghetto, but with the inclusion of some other things that were never included in any of the other volumes, neither Sutzkever's originals and certainly none of the translations. And those were his testimony at Nuremberg, because he served as a Soviet witness at Nuremberg, his diary notes of his testimony at Nuremberg, and then 3 essays on Yiddish writers that he meets as part of his time in Moscow. That is his brief Moscow years, and his interactions with the Yiddish literary world there, that so soon after one catastrophe is on the precipice of its own catastrophe. And then to add to that, obviously the critical apparatus of notes, and then a scholarly essay on this that I co-wrote with my dear colleague Avram Noverstern. So that's what this volume is, and my hope is that it will allow travelers and students alike who go to Vilnius or who want to learn more about this period to really use this as one of several important guidebooks. There are a number of things that are coming out and continue to come out in translation that are critical, and I think it's important that we don't make too many claims just for the work that we do, but also be generous to the work that others do. So there are a number of memoirs that I think are really, really critical out there for people to read. There are a number of diaries, and my hope is together, when these things are all read together, they become some type of conversation, and that we're able to get a sense of sort of what exactly happened, who knew what when, how did people, even after the fact, start to write a type of history that was not only about and for the past, but also for the future? How did they shape things in ways that served the political conditions of the moment? And all of those things, I think, are questions that were on my mind, but also that should be on the mind of readers as they're reading these primary texts.
I definitely, having read it when I was in Vilnius, I had those moments of remembering certain pieces from the book, and it was just fascinating. I unfortunately didn't bring it with me, but it was incredible. You know, I saw an old image, it was in a guidebook of the burial society. And of course there's, you know, and approximately where this was located. And so standing there and thinking of that moment when he hides in a coffin, and in hiding in a coffin composes a poem, that was quite incredible of an experience for me. So yes, it does end up serving as a sort of guidebook in a almost paradoxical way. I was wondering, what do you see as the book's value as a work of testimony versus a work of literature? Because of course, Sutzkever reads quite differently as a poet, as opposed to as a memoirist, or, you know, in terms of a literary work.
So this is another realization that I came through, or even a correction that I came to through interactions with colleagues. There's a number of ways to answer this. When I first came into the project, what I thought was, how is it that this, you know, fairly famous Yiddish poet, perhaps the most important Yiddish poet of the latter half of the 20th century, published a memoir of the Ghetto years in 1947 and never had it republished in Yiddish, never went back to offer corrections or edits, never really advocated for its republication, never talked about it or wrote about it in interviews? Because that was one question. And then a second question was, as a literary scholar, if all of these scholars and students and those interested in the history of World War II are quoting Sutzkever's poems, well, why wouldn't we want to go back to the memoir to find out the actual circumstances that surround those poems? So I said, okay, great. You know, he has his famous poem, A Wagon Shoes. I'm going to find out, you know, about his mother's shoes, or the lead plates of the Rome press. Let's go and find out what he has to say. Or about the poem, you know, that you just mentioned about the coffin. Let's go and figure out the circumstances of that. And then we can have sort of the poetry, and we can have the circumstances. And what I realized is that none of that was possible. That Sutzkever was not, that perhaps that, how to frame this, the historicity of his poems was not his primary motivation as a writer. That is, it doesn't, and in many cases, whether or something actually happened is not the right question that we should be answering, right? So we know that what he writes about in the lead plates of the Rome press in that poem did not happen. We just know that. So what he's writing is for an entirely different register. The register of art, the register of collective memory, the register of providing people with a way to look forward, the register of making sense as a writer of what's going on, but not necessarily the responsibility. The responsibility of the poet isn't the same responsibility as the historian. So I wasn't able to discover any of that. But what I was able to learn and discover, that everything that I thought that was going to be in this, that I was disappointed in not finding, then became a source of a new revelation, right? That Sutzkever's own disinterest in, let's say, this very Nuremberg style of war reportage, right? Or collective voice, where he brings in the voices of others, this very rushed prose that he sort of feels pressured to put together, probably because he really just wanted to get back to writing and editing his own wartime poems. All of this produces a register a certain textuality that's very different than anything else he wrote. And that one of my colleagues wrote to me, says that you have to stop looking for what isn't there and focus on what is there. When you start looking on what is there, the entire text will open up to you. And indeed it did. That was the real challenge, to stop saying, oh, but his poems are so much better than what he's able to communicate about this event. And one of the examples that perhaps I give is that there's a moment in the text where in two short paragraphs, he mentions in prose both the murder of his mother and the murder of his newborn baby. How can it be that, you know, these, what one would consider the major traumatic events in one's life would take up a few lines in prose, but then when you go to the poetry, I mean, you read his poem To My Child, it's one of my, I think it's one of the most devastating and meaningful poems of the Khurban ever to have been written. So what one comes to realize is that perhaps what he wanted to say in one genre was not necessarily what he wanted to say in another genre. And that perhaps this desire, this need, or perhaps just this responsibility to fulfill the request of his Soviet rescuers was something that he felt he needed to do, that he had to do, but it needed to be done in a way that met certain expectations of what that could be at that political moment and in that environment in Moscow, and that wasn't able to do everything that perhaps he would do in a different genre, that he would do in his prose poetry, or that he would do in his writing years later. So all of these things were ways of relearning how to read a text that I thought I knew. And really the fourth answer to your question was I was frustrated by the fact that people didn't seem to think that this text was worthwhile to translate, that somehow putting it out there in the world would be a diminishment of Sutzkever, that everything he had to say about the war was in his poetry or in his stories. And why would you translate something that was written sort of quickly, maybe under pressure, maybe under certain political constraints? Why would one do that? And I think that, you know, I think the result is you do it because if you have a great writer, you want to translate and put out as much as you can by them, and then leave it to readers and scholars to evaluate how it fits into the entire corpus, right? So we have this new translation, this brand new English translation of Kafka's diaries. It's entirely different than the translation of diaries that I grew up reading. I don't think anyone would say to Kafka, you know, these are Kafka's diaries. He really didn't want them published. He asked for them to be burned. You know, they're not as good as The Trial or The Castle. It's not really worth your time publishing them. Well, we can recognize, I think, as readers, that there's a difference between reading his diaries and reading The Trial. And my hope here is that people can recognize that there's a difference between what Sutzkever is doing at a particular moment in time in writing this than what he's doing elsewhere in his oeuvre. And that was really the challenge. And then there were other, you know, pockmarks along the road. I remember being at Yad Vashem, where I was told in no uncertain terms that there was no need to translate this book. And why do you scholars of Yiddish always need to have your Yiddish heroes? Clearly, all one needs to read of Vilna are some of the Hebrew writers, namely Abba Kovner, right? So there are always ways that through opposition, you then get encouraged to do more.
Absolutely. And it's funny when you're talking about these artistic flourishes, when I was talking to Samuel Bach before our interview, and I mentioned that, you know, I was so tickled to find him in Sutzkever's work. And he said, yes, but he says I have blue eyes and I do not have blue eyes.
Right, exactly.
You know, he focuses on how these blue eyes, blue-gray eyes, this skin that's like a Madonna, you know, all of this. And it's like, you know, it is very poetic. And apparently there's a prize that Bach wins that didn't actually exist, you know, but you can see the poet in him sort of creeping out, which is interesting.
And that goes back to your other question, right? Because we're in a moment, we've always been in a moment, but that moment is heightened now, where there are those who want to deny the Holocaust, right? So what happens when you have a writer writing a memoir who also likes to poeticize and perhaps make up certain things, right? So when you ask about what the genre of this text is, it's a challenging text because it's both personal memoir, but personal memoir filtered through the eyes of someone who has a mythological and metapoetic impulse. It's also him as the receiver of the testimony as others, who then needs to translate those testimonies out by virtue of his reputation, out into the world. So you have sort of a polyvocal and also very personal text at one and the same time. So it's very important for people to recognize that memoir is not history, right? Memoir can be used by historians as a way to reconstruct history, but he's not a historian. And this text is not a history of the Vilna Ghetto. It's an interpretation that he writes in 1944 at a particular moment in time and in a particular place. And then we do with it what we can.
Now, translation is always a balancing act of how much you can keep of the original essence of a work while conveying the work's message most coherently. And to me, when I'm translating from Russian, for instance, my translations always seem doomed to fail the original works. Can you speak to the complexity of this specific translation? And also, I was fascinated to see that you do, I suppose, lecture on translation at Smith College. So what are your thoughts on translation and that particular balancing act?
So one of the challenges of this text is that Sutzkever exists in a world and is writing for Yiddish readers in a world where there are certain things that he doesn't need to explain just because of an assumption of common understanding, and in a world that is Yiddish geographically. That is Yiddishly, not only Yiddish imagined, but has Yiddish names that are different than we might say the official names. So I think one of the things that I wrote in the translator's introduction, and one of the challenges of the text, would be to not make, there are different theories of translation, right? One is to make the text as easy for the target audience as possible so that it seems natural for them. And then there's another theory of translation that says, no, you should put in at certain moments certain trips for the new audience so that they recognize that they're reading in translation and not in original, and that they have to do some work of their own. So one of the questions here is, for instance, there's a lot of street names that he mentions in the ghetto, a lot of places. What language do you put that in for an English reader, right? Sutzkever grows up in a city where there are Polish names for those streets. Nowadays, if one like you or my students goes to Lithuania, those streets are now Lithuanian names. So, but putting Polish names doesn't make sense because it's no longer Polish, but the streets weren't necessarily all Lithuanian, nor did the Jews who were experiencing the ghetto refer to them according to Lithuanian names. So I chose in most cases to keep in the Yiddish street names, as Yiddish speakers would have said them. And that was, a source of discussion, continues to be a source of discussion among the publishers who published this book at McGill, Queens. What do you do with Yiddish street names? What do you do with the names for Yiddish cities or towns or shtetls? Do you use the Yiddish name? Do you use the pre-war name? Do you use the current Belarusian or Lithuanian name? Not an easy question. So my goal was to, at different moments, remind readers of the importance to Sutzkever and other ghetto residents, and especially to his reconstruction of a place that no longer existed, that for him, that place was Yiddish speaking. And that Yiddish speaking place also had Yiddish references. And to translate those out of the memoir, to me, make no sense, would have made no sense. But I recognize that for others reading it, it can be an entry into a world that no longer exists. How are they going to find these streets if those streets aren't on any map that they can actually recognize? So part of this was sort of just an exercise in translation theory and what would work where, when, and what I could get away with, frankly. Even the title of the book, right? the Soviet edition and the Paris edition have two different names. One was called Vilna Ghetto, and one was called Of the Vilna Ghetto, or From the Vilna Ghetto. And the translation is From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, which is never, not on any text, and certainly wasn't Sutzkever's. So that's entirely, me opening it up and taking some liberties with what the content of the text is able to produce. And also, I think importantly, to fill in some of that missing period in Sutzkever's scholarship of those few years that he was in Moscow. I think it's a really interesting moment to see how far being in a Soviet system as a writer allowed him to do certain things or disallowed him from doing certain things. His discomfort with winning, Soviet prizes is clear. Yet there's a famous photograph that I include of him at the end of the book where he's clearly wearing a pin with the hammer and sickle on it. So that's perhaps another reason why Sutzkever never really returned to this text, that after making it to the West, first to Łódź, then to Paris, then to Palestine and Israel, and then the Cold War that happens after that, perhaps Sutzkever just didn't want to return to a text that was so associated with this period that now was politicized in a different way. So that the sort of the what you come to a text for, how you translate a text, what you leave in the original, what you take out of the original and translate in something that's more understandable for readers, becomes sort of the intellectual fun of the exercise. Anyone who's translated knows that the idea that translation is not scholarship is ridiculous, right? There's an assumption, people write monographs and, translators, they're doing important work and producing sources for us, but translation is creative, translation is scholarly, and translation is also a technique. And I think the much of what we know about the world and civilizations and peoples that aren't ours comes through the work, not of scholars, but of translator scholars who are able to bring it to us at a level that we can understand and digest.
Now, we're not going to have a formal Q&A, so if anybody wants to message me any questions, or if anybody wants to raise a hand, feel free. One of our audience members was wondering whether what you see as the difference between his biased view, his particular angle as writing the history of the Vilna Ghetto versus what a historian's view would be. Because of course,
Right.
When I was talking to Ilya in Vilnius, he was making the comment that when you have a single archival document that says, the Lithuanians were hesitant to participate in a pogrom at this time, that the
Right.
Jewish scholar is going to say they were participating in a pogrom at some time, that the Lithuanian scholar might be, more apt to say they were hesitant to participate in this, they were compelled to participate in this. So we have a single archival source as historians, and we still look at it through our own lens. How do you feel, what do you feel is the difference between what Sutzkever did as testimony, as curating this testimony, versus what a historian would do with your own bias?
So it's a great question. So one is methodology, right? Historians are trained in certain methodologies. Of course, I think now we're at a moment where we recognize that history itself is also a form of narration and is a form of construction, and that historians regularly include perhaps sources that help their argument or exclude or downplay sources that don't. Nonetheless, I think there is a difference between a memoirist who is responsible ostensibly only to the way that they remember things and how that then is communicated through them, or how they hear certain things. Sutzkever was not a historian and therefore had no professional responsibility, as historians do to actually use archival sources, primary sources, backup sources in case he hears something that perhaps is different from one oral source than another one. So a historian, even though the idea of bias is present in everything, historians have certain professional responsibilities in how they go about interpreting things that memoirists don't, right? You know, I mean, we want memoirists to provide as accurate a picture as they can of a particular experience or historical event. But the assumptions that I do when I come and reading a memoirist is that this memoirist can be constructing something for a whole variety of reasons. When I go to a historian, even historians who I think get it wrong sometimes or have misinterpreted something, I still have an expectation of them that they're using sources, a variety of different sources in order to inform that construction. So it's not an easy question, right? And it's certainly a vexed question, even at the heart of history. I mean, I've seen people argue that there's no difference between literature and history anymore. I think that that's a little bit overboard, a little bit too postmodern. And I think that, you know, there's great history being written about this period by wonderful historians, including especially now a whole new generation of historians in Lithuania that's really worth paying attention to, and that they will use sources like Sutzkever's memoir or like Kruk's diary, but then, you know, look at other things, see where they differ, look at sources that perhaps they didn't know about at the time, and then reevaluate what is written in those texts and provide us with a clear assumption about perhaps what they were thinking, what they were meaning, or perhaps, remember, in memoir, you can misunderstand certain things, right? What you think you know isn't necessarily reality, or it's only the reality that you're able to imagine, not necessarily the total reality. So we have to be very careful with these texts.
Now, one of our students, Julian, who originally read this memoir in German, actually, before you translated it for the rest of us, he describes Sutzkever as a sort of bridge builder with language as a bridge, that Sutzkever excavates and then builds out the figurative bridges to religious and philosophical traditions of Judaism. And he does this by paying tribute to acts of resistance and by communicating his understandable desire for revenge and vengeance. As you worked on the translation, what are some of the questions you would have wanted to ask him?
To ask Sutzkever?
Yes, for clarification or just overall about the experience. What does he leave out that perhaps you would have wished to ask his ghost?
Well, I think because of I think we can fairly state right now that because of the politics in which it was written, he was encouraged to not pay as much attention as either he knew or otherwise would have to acts of what we might call Lithuanian nationalist collaborators. So not the entire Lithuanian nation or people, but individual collaborators or groups of collaborators, and instead focus most of the attention on Nazi perpetrators. I think that there is probably a disproportionate balance in the text between his focus on the number of non-Jews who were willing to risk their lives to save Jews, as opposed to naming the numbers of local collaborators. And I think that that was definitely a response to Soviet conditions that we articulate a little bit more in the afterword. And that's why I think this makes it a very sensitive text, and will become a sensitive text when it appears in Lithuania, because I think it doesn't include as much as it perhaps might on that topic. So I would love to know whether that assumption is right. I think it does a lot of things that are super interesting as a text, and that perhaps maybe even without him knowing predicted certain directions in Holocaust studies or certain controversies. So for instance, I co-teach a course on the Holocaust with a historian, and we just disagree on whether cultural and spiritual resistance is resistance, right? So there's still an argument, a well-meaning argument, I think an important argument, over whether resistance is really only physical resistance, or whether resistance is writing a poem, is organizing a theater, is building a school actually resistance, or might it be a way to distract a community into a sense of, abnormal normalization, when really their focus should have been on something much different. So that's one, the degree to which at least a quarter, if not more, of this document is all about what we might call cultural and spiritual resistance and community self-organization, what does he think about all that in retrospect? Another thing that he predicted that I find really fascinating is the degree to which this text focuses on the heroism of women, right? So when we think of the underplaying of the role of women in Holocaust studies and now gender in the Holocaust as a rising field, just to think that this text, 1944, he spends a lot of attention focused, on everything from his mother to the heroism of women who are giving birth illegally, to women who are teachers and risking their lives, to women who are actually fighters and partisans and couriers. I think we may think that that's totally natural, but there were a lot of texts that don't pay attention in as much to that degree. And I think that I'm not sure that Sutzkever was highlighting it because he was trying to call attention to women per se, but I think it's interesting that it was so natural a part of that world that it shows us that we need to do a better job integrating those histories. And I think that the other thing about the text that might be interesting to people is the degree to which it included photographs. Now, we may say, well, why would that be interesting? Well, we're talking about 1944, 45, and it being published in early to mid 47. Many of those iconic pictures that we tend to associate with the Holocaust are just coming out or haven't even come out by that time, or at least haven't been circulated in a mass way, in the way we know. So for him to organize, and different photographs in different editions, depending on where they're published, documents, pictures of Nazis, pictures of women partisans, pictures of teachers, pictures of himself holding a gun where clearly he only got the gun, after returning for liberation for the picture, or that particular gun for that picture. All of those are meant to construct a visual iconography of that experience that can then be read as its own text. And as I think the way he puts those pictures together is very conscious, right? Starting in one volume with a picture of himself holding a machine gun and ending with a picture of King David, right? And a statue that was discovered. Well, King David was the fighter poet, and Sutzkever here is establishing himself as the fighter poet. King David ruled over Jerusalem. He poetically ruled over the Jerusalem of the north. It can't be accidental that these are the bookends. It might have been unconscious, but it can't be accidental that these images bookend the images that he chooses to include in the text itself. And then everything in between tells its own visual story that one could then say, even if the memoir didn't exist, if you just had these images, then it would allow historians of photography in the Holocaust to reconstruct a type of narrative through how they're organized. And I think I would love to ask him about that as well.
So we have just two more questions. The first will be from Dr. Pilnick, and then the last one is mine. But for the first question, how did Sutzkever's family receive your project and then the resulting book? And what do you think would be his reaction if he saw it in print now?
Well, I'm in very close contact with his family. I've known his granddaughter for a number of years, who facilitated the permissions for the text. And I think that she has been instrumental in sort of the number of texts that are now being translated by Sutzkever into various languages. So the family itself was very cooperative. She even gave me access to their library of photographs and certain documents that I hadn't known about. So they were very generous about it. And I think Sutzkever himself would recognize the necessity of the text and hopefully would be able to, my hope is that he would be able to say, wow, it's actually quite interesting to have the memoir exist side by side with my testimony at Nuremberg, and how those two things that were published separately are now brought together. My hope is that he would say, he wouldn't say, why did you include an essay on Ilya Ehrenberg and the great Soviet Yiddish writer Peretz Markish in a volume on the Vilna Ghetto? Because I would then say to him, these are all one piece, right? You're interacting with Ilya Ehrenberg, and you're interacting with Peretz Markish, and you're interacting with other Yiddish writers at the same time that you're writing this memoir. And the experiences, their experiences, and what you're hearing from them about either their degree of self-censorship or actual censorship is also then influencing what you're able to write in this text and what you're able to do in the text. So I think that all three of those different things coming together, memoirs of writers that he met in Moscow, testimonial memoirs, and the memoir itself come, hopefully he would say, together as a particular moment in understanding and interpreting his work, although I would never speak for him.
Yes, it's actually quite fascinating when you say that, because in Samuel Bach's memoir, his escape from the Soviet Union was precipitated by Sutzkever's work being read, and it was Peretz Markish who told Bach's mother that that Bach was selected for a special school in Moscow, and that precipitated their escape from the Soviet Union. You know,
right, and that's why I think they're all together, right?
Exactly. The historical figures are speaking to each other, but so are the texts, you know?
Exactly. And that's why I thought it would be super interesting, given that this had never been done before, to bring these three different bodies of materials together into one English language volume.
And you know what you said about the questions of what is resistance and women's roles in the two courses in which we studied this book, those were the questions that the students brought forth and that they saw. So you're quite on point with that.
I'm glad.
Yes, you've succeeded. So the last question is mine. You undertook multiple research trips to Vilnius and Jerusalem throughout your work, but also through the process of this book. And you've also mentioned that you've recently taken students for a course to Vilnius in Yiddishkeit. And of course, you know that I just returned from Vilnius. What are your impressions of the way that modern Vilnius contends with this darkest chapter in its history? And in a sense, how does Vilnius treat its ghosts?
Well, that's a huge question. And I'm not sure whether I, as a non-Lithuanian scholar, should answer it. So I should say, certainly, when you say the darkest period in its history, I would open up the possibility that, at least for Lithuanians, there were other that the Soviet occupation was as dark for them as the Nazi occupation is for those of us here today. So it's just something that has to be put into consciousness. And I would say that, like many fairly newly democratic states, and some democratic states that have been around for a lot longer, there is a lot of tension between what we might say more liberal democratic forces and more nationalist forces. We not only see that in our own country in the United States, but we see it in Poland, we see it in Israel. So this is not unusual that a country like Lithuania, with its own histories, would also have those same tensions. I would say that, my reading of the reactions to certain books by Lithuanian journalists, or efforts by scholars to perhaps not allow as many street signs that would honor people who are seen as Lithuanian nationalist heroes, but also played a role in the murder of Jews, to not have those necessarily as public, would be something that we would want to talk about. We would certainly want to talk about the Museum of Genocide and how interesting the history of that space is in the broader way of Lithuanians thinking about genocide more broadly. But these are tough topics, but I never presume, right? I mean, the Civil War ended in the United States 150 years ago, more than that. And we're still arguing about whether we should have statues in certain places. In our country, we're fighting right now about censoring books. So I don't think that, as a scholar based in the United States, I should be the one necessarily weighing in on. We should help our fellow colleagues and our fellow citizens who believe in principles of liberal democracy, fight for those values, but I wouldn't want to misspeak and misstep on those issues. So I think on that, I would leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, I really found my ideas before I went to Vilnius challenged by actual Vilnius, and that was quite moving for me. So to close all of this, firstly, I would like to thank you for speaking with me today and for your passionate advocacy of both Sutzkever, of the Yiddish language, and of just complexity in general and complexity in scholarship. I love when we're presented with nuance. That is most important to me, and I think you've done that. So thank you very much. Thank you also to Vilnius University for the partnership. I was truly awed by the beauty of the historic institution when I visited, the warmth.
Isn't it amazing? That place is amazing.
Oh, I even went into the observatory room and saw the old instruments, and it's just, you know, the walls, the whole city, the walls and the stones speak to you, but at the university, you definitely feel that. So we've been incredibly lucky to have that partnership. And this speaker series, as well as the course on Lithuanian Jewish history, Poland and Lithuania, life in that space, the Holocaust in Lithuania, and the complexity of Holocaust memory has just been incredibly enriching. So I would like to thank the Fish Center and Dr. Shai Pilnik, Emil Fish for valuing Holocaust education. I would like to thank all of you for the opportunities, as well as Hodaya Blau and Brittany Hager. And I would very much like to thank Elliot Matz and the Rumsheskis Marketown Museum Corporation for awarding me the research grant through which I was able to visit. And just a general thank you for the whole comprehensive lens of the ways in which all of these opportunities were presented. For me, I think it gave me an incomparable understanding of not just the world that existed, not just the Holocaust itself, but what nation building and what myth making can look like. And I think that's just incomparable. So thank you to all of you for that. Thank you to our audience, of course, and please check out the recordings of past sessions that we have on the Fish Center's YouTube channel, and have a lovely rest of your Sunday.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.